At 20 meters long from the pointed canopy to the exhausts, the Thumper was not an overly impressive sight, but it wasn't meant to be. Designated as a drone cutter, the Thumper was a three-seated, sleek ship that looked like a long, narrow arrowhead. It was designed for stealth, speed, and most importantly, scouting. The vessel was in a retroburn, and unlike most of the other strike craft, it lacked the precision to stop quickly. Indeed, the Thumper took more space to come to a stop than a battleship, but again, it wasn't what a strike-class craft like the Thumper was designed for. A segment of the hull slid back near the drive section of the Thumper, and a small craft exited the larger craft as the exhausts turned off. "Drone out," Kukit chirped, and the white and speckled brown-scaled Chua unclasped her harness. "Go time, Jess." The Chua threw up her hands and mimicked what her human friend did all the time, kicking up her feet and curling her hands behind her neck as she floated in the 0G. The Thumper was one of only a few ship classes that didn't have artificial gravity, or compensators, and that made it either hated or loved. Kukit loved it. She tried to mimic the sound Jess made when she relaxed, a loud sigh of contentment, but it came out as a high-pitched trill. Kukit closed her eyes in satisfaction, then opened them slowly and looked to the woman she had spoken to, trilling again softly. The woman stared at her for a few seconds, then seemed to curl into a ball. "I'm dragging you off and putting you in a dress with bows." Jessica Anders clapped her hands together, her green eyes wide as she looked down at Kukit. Her short, cropped blonde hair framed her expression a little too perfectly. "And little slippers." Kukit quickly uncrossed her hands and canted her head to the side, blinking twice. "You not dare." Jessica's eyes had taken on that really predatory vibe again, and Kukit felt the distinct urge to defend herself against the massive mammal. "You not serious?" Kukit blinked her eyes once more, and Jessica made the sound again, clapping her hands together and actually jittering in place. "You're just so damned cute," Jessica squealed and went to charge the small Chua, but pulled up short when Kukit drew her small field knife. "I cut you," Kukit declared, holding out the knife towards her. It didn't help matters that the knife was about the size of something the humans called a toothpick, but then again, Kukit knew what she was doing. Jessica only squealed louder. "Oh, for the love of God, Jessica." Another human female leaned around from a chair in front of Kukit, raven black hair cut in a manner similar to Jessica's. "If you keep this up, I'm duct taping you to the chair. Stop trying to turn Kukit into a doll." "And you." Her dark eyes looked to Kukit. "Can you stop provoking the sicko here?" Kukit mimicked the human shrug, ready to reply, but before she could even begin, the raven-haired woman cut her off with a quick, "Stop it." She looked up at Jessica, whose eyes were even wider than normal when Kukit was trying to get this reaction out of her, and waved her knife back and forth. Jessica closed her eyes and gave out a grumble of frustration when the raven-haired woman snapped, "Jess, the drone." Jessica kicked her legs in the 0G. "Right. Fine." Jess turned around and flopped back into her chair. "Fine." She reached out and pulled her monitor controls down from the ceiling, then reached out and pulled her control sticks and throttle lever from the wall until a click secured them in place. Jessica took her time aligning the drone with the Mandeville point and firing its drive. The woman in the front unclasped her harness and pushed herself up. She turned herself in the 0G with a finger, then stared back at Kukit. "Seriously, though, if you keep this up, I'm going to let her do it," she said, and Kukit sheathed her knife and clasped it so it wouldn't slide free. "I do nothing, Vicky," Kukit insisted, staring up at her, but Vicky simply crossed her arms. Kukit stared at her, blinking every so often, acting as innocent as possible until Vicky had to uncross her arms to steady herself. Kukit lowered her chin and blinked her eyes at Vicky several times, pressing her hands together. "Works on her, not on me," Vicky said flatly, to which the Chua only blinked twice more. Vicky pulled herself to the back of the three-man vessel until she was even with Jessica and Kukit's chairs. Kukit pushed herself out of her chair and Vicky subconsciously reached out, letting Kukit grab hold of her arm and pull herself behind her back to hover over Jessica's opposite shoulder. "By the way, Kukit, numbers are up to 13 million. Vicky glanced over, and Kukit closed her eyes and bobbed her head once. "You already heard?" Another bob of the head. "At this rate, we're going to have to start a transport chain. The fleet had been buzzing for hours as more and more of the Chua had been found on Sakalia, and they had only gotten to a quarter of the bunkers. Vicky had wanted Kukit pulled from this assignment to wait for news of any family that might have survived in the deep bunkers that the Chua had survived in. But Kukit had insisted on doing her duty. Vicky could have chalked this up to general Chua pragmatism. She would have time to reunite if the family was found. But since they had left, it was clear Kukit was in a good mood. It was evidenced by the fact that Chua had dialed her baiting of Jessica up to 11. The three of them wore the uniform of the Terran Front Strike pilots, with Kukit wearing her thermals underneath. But the only real pilot was Victoria Brandy. Jessica and Kukit were her crew. She outranked them. But Vicky had lived most of her life under strict military protocol. When she was out with these two, military formality went out the airlock. They had trained together, they ate together. They had been through 6 months of team building as a trio. At the end of the day, surrounded by the void of space, Vicky would rather not deal with the same formalities as normal, just so long as they acted right once the hatch opened on the Velicor, the battleship that served as their host carrier. Jessica muttered to herself as her hands flew over the computer panels that hung suspended via mounts in front of her chair. Vicky didn't even look at what Jessica was doing. One of the best things about working with Jessica and Kukit was that they could do their job in their sleep. Jessica's hands were taking the scout drone that was currently flying towards the Mandeville Point through the entire pre-jump sequence and had already set its systems for remote record. "Jumping drone," Jessica said, then tapped a few buttons on the panel and flicked the switch on her display to turn off the camera feed from her scout drone. Vicky had asked once why she did that, and to Jessica it was real simple. She didn't like the way it flashed on entry and exit from the lane. Vicky had let it go at that. 2 minutes. The fleet was still at anchorage over Tsakalia, but that wasn't going to last. Already it was being brought down the line that Fleet Marshal Simmons was crawling the walls inside the bridge wing of the Antares. There was another ship like hers at the Mandeville for a jump to Iziact as well as Shivru. Vral was her system to check in on. Vicky and her crew had scouted 4 jumps for the fleet up until this point, including the one from the Kelvin system. Jessica pushed her head back into the padded rest and reached down, pulling her lap belt over and securing it as the counter on one of her panels signaling exit from the lane continued to count down. "You really wouldn't stab me, would you, Cuckoo?" Jessica cooed softly, and Vicky looked over to see that Jessica was leaning her head over, and Kukit was gently stroking her small fingers through Jessica's hair. "Call Cuckoo again." Kukit chirped contently. "Never find body." Vicky suppressed a grin, as she always did around these two. The phrase "get a room" came to mind more than once when she was around them. Jessica, around anyone else, was as crisp and sharp as a crewman could be. Her service record held awards for discipline and several marks for professionalism. If Jessica wasn't here with Vicky, she either was in the ship gym or training in one of 2 martial arts groups. It came as no surprise she was in the top 10% of the fleet when it came to physical fitness. She was serious, stone-faced even. And despite the fact she was in every sense of the word a beauty, she repelled men like water on oil. Vicky had a feeling it was due to the fact that the second anyone spoke to her, Jessica would give them what Vicky called the Siberian death stare. All this brutal, hard exterior cracked like an eggshell the second that Kukit was in sight range. Jessica had one weakness, an absolute Achilles heel. Open up her training manuals, her footlocker, open up Jessica's anything that contained personal belongings, and there were pictures of what Jessica called cuties. The best and only way to get to her good side was to present her an offering of something she considered cute. Kukit, to Jessica, was cute, and Kukit knew this. It had all started in training when Vicky had noticed Jessica continuously glancing towards Kukit's chair no less than 10 minutes into their assignment to each other. They were waiting on a simulation, and Kukit, who had not had leg rests installed into her training chair yet, began to kick her legs back and forth. Jessica had turned a bright red and covered her mouth. Vicky already knew about Jessica's hard-nosed reputation, and had stared in abject shock at Jessica's reflection in her offline monitor as one of the most disciplined and focused women she had ever seen turned into a 2-year-old. The second Kukit figured out Jessica thought she was cute, the Chua had deliberately begun to do everything in her power to crack Jessica's sanity. During an extended time in 0G, she had once squeezed several large drops of water out into the open space between their chairs, and then started pushing off to slowly drift by, making humming noises and taking in the water by opening her mouth and swallowing the bubbles. Jessica was reduced to ruins and fits. Vicky herself had to restrain herself from turning a lot when they were between transits and just floating because Kukit had no mercy, and it was hilarious. The three of them were a trio, and Vicky didn't care if they offered her command of a corvette tomorrow. She'd stay in her place to stay with them. Jessica's head suddenly leaned up from Kukit's, and she narrowed her eyes at her third display. Her hands came back down on her drone's control sticks, and her fingers began to slowly drum on the handles. Vicky raised an eyebrow as her hand snapped up and flicked the switch on her primary monitor, turning the camera feed back on. "Got feeling?" Kukit asked, pulling herself to the other side of the chair from Vicky, both of them looking at Jessica's displays. Jessica reached back out to her third panel and tapped a few keys, bringing up the lane map. Vicky said nothing, even as Jessica reached down and yanked hard on her lap belt, pulling herself down hard into the seat and securing it firmly across her waist. Vicky looked from Jessica to Kukit, exchanging a glance. Without a word, they both snapped into action. Kukit crawled down the side of the chair as Vicky pushed herself down. Both of them began pulling Velcro straps around either side of Jessica's leg rests, cinching them tight into place. Kukit reached out and Vicky grabbed hold of the Chewa's hand, drawing the small form of the Chewa in before turning and guiding her into her seat. Kukit began to strap herself into her chair even as Vicky pulled down on a handle to draw Kukit's control monitors into place. "Sensors, thermals, and probes," Jessica said as Kukit finished with her lap belt. Kukit chirped once, which neither Vicky nor Jessica needed a translator to understand. Vicky pulled similar Velcro straps around Kukit's small legs, even as the Chewa's three-fingered hands flew over her own smaller digital displays. Vicky pushed herself back behind Jessica's chair and took hold of her immersion helmet. "Online," Kukit said. Jessica nodded once, then reached over and flipped 3 switches on her primary control console. "Eye control." Kukit reported once again, and without waiting, Vicky slid the helmet down over Jessica's head, then checked the plugs to make sure nothing had come loose since Jessica had last used it. Jessica secured the helmet and her hands took a tight grip on her controls. Signal delay. 252 mil. Jessica finished for Kukit. Vicky began counting down, pulling herself between the 2 chairs, staring at the center monitor of Jessica's display. The countdown reached 5 seconds, and the center display showed the forward view of the drone even as the screen flashed bright silver. Jessica grunted, and as the solid light turned to streaks, Jessica rapidly turned her head to check her vision. The helmet gave her a full 360-degree view, but all Vicky could see was the forward display. In the last blink before the drone's lane exit, timing the delay, Jessica had thrown the throttle to full and yanked back hard on her controls. Vicky saw the entire screen flooded with a blistering light but said nothing as Jessica turned her head, following something only she could see. Her hands pushed the sticks hard, revving the throttle even as Vicky's only view to what was happening became a nauseating spin and counterspin, and Vicky couldn't make out a single detail. Jessica suddenly started counting down from 3. Vicky turned her head to look at the Chewa's display. As she reached 1, Jessica's hands released the control sticks. "Away 1!" Kukit chirped, and Jessica's hands slammed the drone into another sickening set of maneuvers. "Jumpers," Jessica growled out, and without waiting for another word, Vicky let go of both chairs and slammed her foot into the panel behind her, launching herself towards her pilot's chair. Vicky pulled her headset into place and yanked her harness around her body. "Thumper to mothership, come back," Vicky said as she began to prime the Thumper. Her fingers flew over controls as she waited, feeling in her spine the drive coming back to full power. She didn't touch her primary controls for fear of throwing off what the 2 in the back were trying to work through. She heard Jessica swearing, Kukit's silence, then Jessica counting down again. "Thumper, this is Velicor flight status." Vicky heard the familiar voice of Major Henderson in her ear and began her report. "Thumper has possible chasers," Vicky said. "Away 2. Kukit chirped behind her. "Number and class," came the reply. "Unknown. Unverifiable." Vicky reached down to her side and grabbed her rubber mouthpiece, getting it ready. "Are you en route?" Major Henderson questioned, his voice clean and detached, calm and in control. Vicky liked Henderson for that reason as a flight officer. The man could be standing in a 4-alarm fire and talk like he was comparing ration bars. Negative, drone is still gathering intel. Vicky looked back at Jessica then, although she knew Jessica couldn't see her. Her hands were bone white against the controls, trying to keep the drone alive on the other side of the lane for as long as possible against whatever it was that she was evading. In her mind, Vicky wanted to scream her support for Jessica, but stayed silent. Jessica didn't need that right now. She needed total concentration. "Thumper, we are routing a cover detail. Strike 276, Henderson said. Vicky reached over to a keypad, typing in the number. "Understood." As she finished keying in the number and submitted it, a red marker appeared on her viewport. She didn't have to ask, but she already knew that somewhere in the darkness fighters were turning towards her and burning as hard as they could. She looked back over her shoulder at Jessica, seeing her yanking her head from side to side as her hands controlled the drone. "Done," Kukit trilled loudly, and Jessica let go of the controls, reaching up and tearing the helmet off of her head before shoving it back into its storage compartment. Vicky began to count down from 10. Jessica yanked her mouthpiece from a pocket and shoved it in place, biting down on the rubber and pushing her head against the rest. Kukit was doing the same, whimpering softly. Vicky knew this was going to hurt Kukit, but they had no choice. Vicky pressed her control stud for her comms transmission backup. "Striking in 5, she said. "Acknowledged," Henderson said, even as Vicky shoved her mouthpiece in and bit down on the rubber and pulled back on her controls. The Thumper's positional thrusters hurled the ship around, and Vicky watched the green marker become a green circle. In her head, she counted 2, 1. Vicky let her body go limp and crushed her eyes together. The Thumper slammed her back into her chair, and Vicky felt the air crushed out of her as the engine shot them away from the Mandeville point at a force of 22 Gs. The force peeled back quickly, and she forced herself to breathe in short gasps to stay awake as the initial force pulled back to 8.5 Gs. The speed of the Thumper kept climbing, and Vicky counted down in her head. She reached 30 seconds, and as quickly as it had started, the assault on her body was over. She pulled her mouthpiece out and put it in her breast pocket, then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, Kukit," she whispered. The engine kicked on hard again. She grimaced as once again her body was assaulted by another 8.5 Gs. Her mouthpiece felt like a brick pressing down against her chest as her saliva sunk through her flight suit. She counted down in her head even as Henderson's voice came through. "Thumper, 4 corvettes dropping." Vicky felt the force recede again. "We'll need intercept and medical transmitting drone data," she said. Then she took several quick breaths as she pressed a few keys on a control terminal to her right. Her viewport's edges flashed yellow, then red. "Shit," she whispered and snatched her hand back to her side so she wouldn't break her arm. Once again, the Thumper's drive engaged. She focused on her breathing as the edges of her vision started to dim. "Barrowmore is aligning to intercept. Fast movers are inbound." Henderson came over, and Vicky was glad again that it was him on the line. If it had been another flight controller, they might have bombarded her, asking why she was calling for it. They might have screamed about the missiles that had just been launched at her. Vicky felt tears in her eyes, and not from the effects of high G-force. She could barely move her body, but she didn't dare try. Again, after 20 seconds, the Thumper relented. "Deploying countermeasures," Vicky said, pressing down on a lever on her control stick. The Thumper hit her again, and she almost lost consciousness before she got her breathing back under control. Ahead of the Thumper, marked on her viewport by a host of green triangles, fighters were screaming towards her. She wished she had their liquid-suspended cockpits right now. The drive of the Thumper continued to pin her against her chair as their speed continued to increase. She continued the halted breathing that would keep her mind working, keep the darkness from closing in. Thumper relented finally. The green lights of the fighter indicators were barely beginning to move, but at her speed, they would pass the fighters in the next burn. She eyed her speed and then blew out a breath. She didn't dare look at the time to intercept on the inbound missiles. Speed was her only ally. The safeties built into ships built to ensure that rapid changes in gravity wouldn't cause issues for the crew. Even the fighters had a capped speed because even though the liquid-filled cockpits would shield the pilots well, it would only go so far. The drone cutter had none of those safeties. If she didn't cut off the engine, it would fire until the reactor ran out of fuel. The Thumper bucked again, and she hitched her breathing, feeling the corners of her vision blurring from the prolonged assault on her body. The fighters were suddenly past her, and she couldn't remember having seen them pass. At the 15-second mark in the burn, she was trying not to scream. Her small 57-kilo frame in 1G, struggling to cope with weighing nearly half a ton over and over again. The Thumper relented again, and Vicky squinted her eyes shut, praying she wouldn't have to continue her acceleration burn. Her red flashing on the edges of her viewport suddenly stopped. She didn't know if the fighters got them or her countermeasures had, but in either case it was good news. "Thumper, you are clear," Henderson said, and before he was even done speaking, Vicky had disengaged the drive. "Enemy corvettes are re-entering lane. Status." "Secured," Vicky yelled out and looked back towards Jessica, who was yanking at her straps as if she had downed an entire bottle of alcohol. She wasn't worried about Jessica right now. "Thumper, standing down, stand by for crew status," Vicky said into her headset as she yanked on her harness clasps and pulled herself out of her seat, pulling off the headset as she floated quickly towards Kukit's chair. To her relief, the Chua was slowly opening and closing her eyes. Jessica shoved herself out of her station towards Kukit. "Kukit, talk to me here," Jessica said, and Vicky saw her resisting the urge to unstrap the Chua from her seat, even as she pulled out Kukit's mouthpiece. Kukit's eyes were glazed over, her small body looking as if it had been thrown against a wall repeatedly. Vicky reached the station as well, then pulled herself towards the floor, opening a small hatch and pulling a blue-marked medical from inside. "Come on, Kukit," Jessica whispered, her eyes glancing towards Vicky as she snapped open the box and lifted out a small mask with a pressurized flask attached. Jessica took one look at the flask and suddenly couldn't figure out what to do with her hands. "Jess, get a vein finder and a bag of TS-790, Vicky said, stripping all the emotion out of her voice. Vicky would be able to do it herself once she attached the mask and activated the flask, a chemical compound meant to induce a coma for the Chua. "Get this thing out of my way too," she said as her back hit the displays. Jessica yanked up on the monitors and then used the momentum to go to the floor towards the Chua's medical kit. Vicky gently placed the face mask on the small mouth, but as she was moving the elastic to the back of the Chua's head to secure it, Kukit's eyes blinked once, then twice. "Kukit, you with me," Vicky said, and Jessica almost overshot the chair as she pushed herself up to be at the Chua's side. "Need vacation," Kukit trilled softly. Vicky blew out a breath and took the mask off, letting it drift in the 0G. She felt herself go limp a moment. Then she looked back at Jessica and nodded. She grabbed the flask again and pulled herself back down to the blue kit, replacing it and the bag that Jessica had half taken out. She then grabbed hold of a small cylinder marked PR2 and pulled a small square slip from it. Jessica gently pushed her head against Kukit's and breathed out in relief. Vicky came back up. "Got the good stuff here," Vicky said, holding up the square in front of Kukit and raising an eyebrow. Kukit opened her mouth and let Vicky place the slip on Kukit's tongue. The slip almost instantly dissolved, and a different kind of glazed look came over the Chua altogether. "How are you feeling, better?" "Yes. No worry." Kukit reached over and patted Jessica's head. Jessica let the Chua stroke her hair even as she was careful not to press too hard against Kukit's small frame. "Bullshit, no worry." Vicky grinned as she grabbed Jessica by the shoulder and squeezed it, watching Kukit. "Your cute little ass is going to med bay." "I find a cute nurse for Jess," Kukit said. Jessica drew her head back like she was withdrawing from a snake before grinning and nuzzling her head against Kukit's again. "Oh, the hell you will. Your taste in men is garbage," Jessica said, and even though she was chuckling, Vicky knew she was about to start crying out of sheer relief. The Chua could handle heat that would boil the skin right off a human. They could survive 2 weeks without water. They had a host of physical differences that gave them certain tolerances higher than humans. G-force tolerances were not on that list. Vicky half expected Kukit would have been crushed. From now on, you're in your G-suit when we scout, Vicky said, and her tone left no room for negotiation. Better than dress, Kukit chirped softly. Vicky rolled her eyes, then pushed herself back up to her chair. She drew her headset back over her ears and called back to Henderson. Crew has one injury, chew a female, high-sustained Gs during acceleration burn. Conscious, administered PR2 slip. After a few seconds of silence, she heard Henderson come back. Prepare for interception and onboarding with the Barrowmore. Medical team has been prepped. Turn 2 and initiate 1G retro. After a few more seconds passed, Henderson continued. But this time his tone was far more personable. Tell your people they did a damn good job, Lieutenant. I mean a damned good job. Vicky could already see the green icon of the Barrowmore on her viewport. I didn't have time to ask. What was over there in Vral? A few seconds later, Henderson came back over into her ears. I don't know. But whatever it was enough to get sent up a minute after we got it. Half the fleet is burning to the Vral lane right now, including the Antares. You and yours found something good. Vicky leaned back in her chair. Permission to call it a day on our end, sir, she said, watching as a green square became visible on her viewport, the Barrowmore. Henderson laughed. Granted. Report to the Barrowmore ops officer and submit your status to them. Then stand by your crew and stand down until you get further orders. Velicor out. Thumper out, Vicky said, and then pushed herself back to Kukit's chair to get everyone settled in for the retroburn.